So we continue with our series on biblical characters, and the last couple of weeks we've been dealing with people in the book of Genesis, specifically in the kind of like the middle of the book of Genesis. So we talked about Abraham, and then we talked about Abraham's nephew, who is Lot, and then now today we're going to talk about somebody else connected with Abraham in the book of Genesis, in Genesis 14, but doesn't play so much of a big role in scripture as we would think. He's not mentioned very many times, but he actually does play a huge role, even though he's not mentioned very many times. And this guy, his name is Melchizedek. Melchizedek is mentioned once in the whole book of Genesis, and then he's only mentioned one more one more time in the whole Old Testament. So why is he such a big figure? We'll talk about that right now, but let's figure out who exactly Melchizedek is. So let's put him in context. In the story of the book of Genesis, we saw it last week when we talked about Lot. There was a coalition of kings, Mesopotamian kings. They kidnapped Lot, Abraham's nephew. And so Abraham went and he went to go rescue his nephew and his family. And so Abraham had 318 servants that he kind of armed, and he went and he battled these kings that kidnapped his nephew, and he defeated them, and he was able to rescue Lot. When he came back, when he returned after that kind of war, he met a man named Melchizedek. And Melchizedek, his name means king of righteousness. And if we say it in Chaldean, it makes actually a lot of sense. Melchizedek, okay? That means righteous king, or Melchizedek, something like that, means king of righteousness. So Melchizedek is a construct of two Hebrew words, or two Aramaic words, that means king of righteousness. And he's also called in the book of Genesis, he's named king of Salem. And this is very interesting. What is Salem exactly? Salem is a Hebrew word also, shalom in Hebrew, shlama in Aramaic, Salem in English means peace, right? So what does it mean? Is he the king of peace? Yeah, in some sense he's the king of peace. But Salem is also a city, which Melchizedek is the king of. And what we see in later on in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, Salem becomes Jerusalem. Salem, Jerusalem, right? And Jerusalem, that is the evolution of the word for Ur. Ur Shalem in Aramaic or Hebrew. Ur Shalem means, Ur means, in ancient Semitic languages, it means city. So Ur Shalem or Jerusalem means the city of peace. And that's what the name Jerusalem means. So Melchizedek is the king of this place called Salem, which later will be called Jerusalem. And this is going to be very important as we go forward in the Old Testament, because obviously we know that Jerusalem plays, the major role in salvation history. It becomes the holy city. And so we'll talk about that also in a little bit. But what does the book of Genesis say about Melchizedek? It only says a few things, three things specifically. That his name, it tells us his name, which means king of righteousness. It says that he's the king of Salem. And it says, very interestingly, that he is a priest of God Most High. Melchizedek is the first man specifically named a priest in the whole Bible. We saw before that Adam is a priest, and we know that because he was called to offer a sacrifice to God, and the sacrifice was of himself. He was supposed to offer himself to God, which he failed to do because he committed a sin. Cain and Abel were kind of priestly characters also because they offered sacrifices. Abel's sacrifice was accepted, Cain's was not accepted. Noah is a priestly figure. He offers a sacrifice to God on an altar. Abraham is a priestly figure, right? He offers his son Isaac on an altar. So there's a lot of priestly things going on in the Bible, but the first person specifically to be named a priest is Melchizedek. And what Melchizedek offers is not an animal to God. He offers bread and wine. And this is going to be really important as we go forward also. So what we get about Melchizedek in the Old Testament are kind of very vague things, but these vague things have a ton of importance for understanding what God is doing in salvation history in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. Melchizedek, even though he's so shortly talked about, even though he's talked about in such a small way, Melchizedek does prove to be a very important person because of all the things that are attached to him. He's never mentioned again after Genesis until later on in the book of Psalms. And he's mentioned one time in the book of Psalms, specifically in Psalm 110, where Psalm 110, just to put it in context, the Psalms are songs written by King David and people that came after King David. King David is the king of Israel, and the capital of his kingdom is in Jerusalem. So again, this becomes very important. Okay, King David writes these psalms, and Psalm 110 is a psalm it's a royal coronation psalm, meaning the psalm is sung at the ceremony when the son of David, after David, is crowned king. And what Psalm 110 says is this: the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. Very interestingly, Melchizedek is not mentioned in the whole Old Testament except for one time in the book of Genesis when Abraham meets him, and Melchizedek blesses Abraham and he offers to God bread and wine, and he is called a priest of God Most High. And then he's mentioned again one more time when the son of David is crowned king, and the song says of this new king, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. That means David and David's sons, the kings after David, are priest kings. What does this look like? Well, Melchizedek is a priest and Melchizedek is a king. David and his sons are priest kings like Melchizedek, according to the pattern of Melchizedek. And so Melchizedek becomes this kind of forerunner for David and the kingdom of David and the priesthood of David. Melchizedek is a priest king the way David is a priest king. So Melchizedek becomes this kind of figure that looks forward to David, but also looks backwards to Adam. Because if we remember Adam, when we talked about Adam in the first episode, Adam was called by God to be a king. He was the king over all of creation, and he was called to be a priest. The language that is used of Adam is the language that is used of priests later on. Adam is a king and he's also a priest. Melchizedek comes around, he's a king and he's also a priest. David comes around later and he's the king of Israel and he's also a priest. And we know that David is spoken of in priestly terms because he wears the vestments of a priest. He offers sacrifices to God, which is what a priest does. So let's talk about what is the priesthood in general. Let's have a quick conversation about the priesthood. What is a priest? A priest in Judaism, a priest in Christianity, a priest in even pagan religions. A priest is somebody simply that offers a sacrifice to the deity on an altar. Okay, and now that comes in many forms, right? In Judaism, with Aaron and Aaron's sons after him, they offer animals to God as sacrifices on behalf of the people, for their atonement or in thanksgiving and these kinds of things. In pagan rites, they would offer other things as well. They would offer animals and they would offer many other things. In Christianity, the priest offers the sacrifice of Christ, which is a representation of Jesus on the cross. Jesus' own offering to God on the cross is offered by the priests throughout the ages in the church. And so the priest offers that sacrifice of Christ in the Mass. Melchizedek offers an offering to God also, and that offering is bread and wine. Why is the priesthood so important? Well, again, let's go back to Adam. Adam is a king and he's also a priest. In God's original plan for humanity, humanity is called by God to be kings and to be priests. And to be a priest means to offer a sacrifice. And if we look at Adam, who represents all of humanity, Adam is supposed to offer the sacrifice of himself. God gives Adam everything that he is, and he is called by Adam to offer to God everything back to God, so that this relationship between God and Adam is a relationship of self-giving love. God gives Adam everything that he is, and Adam gives God back everything that he is. And so the sacrifice that Adam is called to offer to God is a sacrifice completely of himself. That becomes corrupted after Adam commits a sin and he doesn't offer himself over to God. And that becomes further corrupted throughout humanity, especially with Cain. And that just gets more and more corrupt. And the sacrifice is less and less. The sacrifice that humanity is called to give to God becomes something less and less as we go forward, when humanity falls deeper and deeper into sin. When we fast forward a little bit to Moses and to Aaron, what we'll see, and I'm only going to talk about this a little bit now because we're going to do this in later episodes, but what we see is God calls the Israelites out of Egypt because they're slaves in Egypt. And God calls all of Israel, his people, these are the descendants of Abraham. God calls them out of Egypt so that they can go and take their own land in the land of Canaan. And God calls Israel a kingdom of priests, a nation of priests. But Israel as a whole nation, they fall into idolatry by committing a sin against God by worshiping other gods. They were supposed to worship only the one God, but they fell into worship of idolatrous gods. And so Israel fell from being a priestly nation by committing that sin by worshiping other gods. And of all the people of Israel, only one tribe did not commit the sin of idolatry, and that was the tribe of Levi. So the Levites were the only tribe of the 12 tribes of Israel that continued to worship the true God, and then they became the only priestly tribe in the whole nation of Israel. The whole nation of Israel was called to be a priestly nation, but only one tribe remained in the priesthood, and that's the tribe of Levi. And so going forward, all the priests of Israel had to prove that they were descendants of Levi to prove that their genealogy goes all the way up to Levi, to show that they are legitimate priests. And so they had to look back in their lineage to prove that they were actually of the priestly line so that they can validate their priesthood. That's why it becomes so important with Melchizedek. Melchizedek is the only guy that doesn't have a genealogy. Up to now, everybody has a genealogy. Noah is, we're given the genealogy of Noah. We're given the genealogy of Abraham. We're given the genealogy of Lot. We're given the genealogy of all these important figures. Melchizedek doesn't have a genealogy. We don't know who his father or mother are. We don't know where he came from. We don't know his lineage. And his lineage is not really important because he's a priest of God Most High, not according to a genealogy, but he's a priest of a kind of natural order, more like the priesthood of Adam. And this will become very important as we go forward in the New Testament. So I want to put the pieces together now. Melchizedek is king of righteousness, and he's the king of Salem, which will later become Jerusalem. David and David's sons are called priests after the order of Melchizedek, and they are also kings. And they are kings in the same city where Melchizedek was a king, in Jerusalem. Why is this important? Because when we go forward to Jesus, Jesus is a priest, and Jesus is a king. And the priesthood of Jesus is not the priesthood according to the Levitical line. Jesus is not a Levite. Jesus is from the line of Judah. Jesus is a son of David. And so Psalm 110, when it says, "You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek," and this is spoken to the son of David who is being crowned the king, is really looking forward to the Messiah, Jesus Christ, who is the son of David, who is a king in the kingdom of David, and who is also a priest according to the order of Melchizedek. Jesus' priesthood is not the priesthood of the line of Levi. Jesus' priesthood looks more like Melchizedek's priesthood, which looks more like David's priesthood, which looks more like Adam's priesthood. Why? Because it's not a priesthood from the lineage of the Levites, but it's a priesthood of a natural order. Just like Adam was called to give himself to God, Melchizedek is a priest after a kind of natural order, a primordial priesthood, where he's called to give himself over to God in peace and in righteousness. And the symbol of these things is the bread and wine, which Melchizedek offers to God. Now, again, let's look forward to Jesus. Jesus, like Melchizedek, is a king. Jesus, like Melchizedek, is a king in the city of Jerusalem, where Jesus is crucified, right? And Jesus takes the kingdom of David. Now, Jesus' kingdom obviously goes beyond earthly boundaries. He's a king out in the kingdom of heaven. But the offering that Jesus offers is himself, like Adam was called to give himself. And Melchizedek is offering himself in being symbolized by the bread and wine that he is offering. Jesus offers himself on the cross and asks us to renew that offering, to represent that offering at every Mass by giving us bread and wine to transform into his body and blood. Just like Melchizedek is a priest and offers bread and wine, Jesus is a priest and he offers bread and wine, which he changes into his body and blood in the Mass, which is his presentation of him giving his body and blood on the cross. And so Melchizedek is this, even though he's barely mentioned and not much is said about him, he's actually a really important figure because of the things that he represents. He's a look backwards to the priesthood of Adam, which God is restoring, and he's a look forward to David and a look forward to Jesus, who is a priest after the order of Melchizedek, just as David and his sons were. So Melchizedek is a king and a priest. Jesus is a king and a priest. Melchizedek offers bread and wine. Jesus offers bread and wine. What this means for us, brothers and sisters, is that the things that we offer to God are the ways that we practice our own priesthood. Israel was supposed to be a kingdom of priests, but it failed because it worshipped other gods. In 1 Peter, in the New Testament, the letter of St. Peter, he calls the followers of Christ, the church, a nation of priests, a kingdom of priests. Just like Israel was supposed to be, the church is now a nation of priests. That doesn't mean that everybody in the church is a priest the way somebody that, like myself, that we offer the sacrifice of Christ on the altar and we share in the ministerial priesthood. But every member of the church, every Christian is called to be a priest by offering themselves in union with Christ. So the priesthood is extended to all the members of the church. And the priesthood, the way we practice the priesthood is by offering a sacrifice, the way all priests offer a sacrifice. But the sacrifice that we offer is of ourselves. We offer ourselves with Jesus, who offers himself on the cross. And this is how we practice our own priesthood. And so, brothers and sisters, Melchizedek is a figure that represents the priesthood that Jesus himself will take up, which is an offering of ourselves over to God, the way Adam was called to offer himself over to God. In Melchizedek, and finally and definitively in Jesus, the whole priesthood is being restored. The priesthood of Adam, which is the primordial priesthood that God had designed, a priesthood of self-offering gift over to God in recognition of the gifts that God has given us. Melchizedek gives thanks to God. Jesus gives thanks to God. And this is in the form of bread and wine. And this is what the word Eucharist means. Eucharisteo in Greek means thanksgiving. Jesus, like Melchizedek, gives thanks to God by giving to God bread and wine. But in Jesus, his thanksgiving is one so great that he's giving himself totally over to God. And what looks like bread and wine, Christ is giving his whole body and blood, his whole existence over to God. And in union with Jesus, we give thanks to God by giving ourselves fully to God in Christ, who is offering himself over to God. Let us go forward and offer a pleasing offering to God, which is our hearts, which is our minds and our bodies, which is our entire self. Jesus gave himself over to God completely. We that live in Jesus are called to give ourselves totally over to God in everything that we do. And so let's go forward in life, in our spiritual lives, directing everything to God. Everything that we do, everything that we say, everything that we think, every way that we act, let us give over to God and do what is pleasing to God, because God has done everything for us. In thanksgiving, let us give everything back over to God.